The world of high society can be as cruel as it is glamorous. When billionaire tech mogul Richard Harlow's wife Vivian decided to publicly mock Usha Vance at the prestigious Metropolitan Charity Gala, she thought she was simply reinforcing the social hierarchy. Little did she know that her carefully crafted insult would backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. Comment where you're watching from today, because this story of humiliation turned triumph is one you won't soon forget. Usha Vance was never supposed to be at the Metropolitan Charity Gala. As the daughter of Indian immigrants who had worked tirelessly to provide her with opportunities in America, she had risen through the ranks of society through sheer determination and brilliance. But to women like Vivian Harlow, Usha would always be an outsider, regardless of her husband's political connections or her own sterling credentials as a former law clerk to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The Metropolitan Charity Gala had always been the crown jewel of the social season, where old money and new tech wealth converged in a dazzling display of philanthropy and fashion. The guest list was curated with surgical precision, and invitations were coveted more than designer handbags or luxury cars. For decades, the Harlow family had practically owned the event, with Vivian serving as chairwoman of the Gala committee for the past 5 years. When Usha and her husband received their invitation, whispers immediately began circulating through Manhattan's elite social circles. Some claimed it was a diplomatic necessity, others insisted it was merely for diversity's sake, but no one believed the Vances truly belonged among the glittering aristocracy of American wealth and power. What happened that night would become the stuff of legend, a perfect storm of old prejudices, wounded pride, and one woman's refusal to be diminished. By the end of the evening, the carefully constructed social hierarchy would be turned upside down, leaving the audience stunned, and one particularly arrogant billionaire's wife wishing she had never opened her mouth. The tension had been building throughout the evening, with Vivian making passive-aggressive comments, just loud enough to be heard by those nearby, but not directly confrontational enough to cause a scene. Little barbs about new money and proper etiquette were strategically dropped whenever Usha was within earshot. The other socialites tittered nervously, recognizing the power play, but unwilling to intervene. Usha maintained her composure with remarkable grace, focusing instead on the gala's charitable mission and engaging meaningfully with other guests about the education initiative the event was fundraising for. Her dignity in the face of such blatant disrespect only seemed to inflame Vivian's determination to provoke a reaction. The Metropolitan Charity Gala represented everything America claimed to stand for: opportunity, generosity, and the beautiful fiction that anyone could rise to the top through hard work and determination. But beneath the veneer of philanthropy lay the uncomfortable truth that some doors remained firmly closed to outsiders, no matter their accomplishments or contributions. As champagne flowed and the orchestra played, the two women moved through the crowd like opposing chess pieces, one attempting to corner the other. The Harlow name carried tremendous weight. Richard's technology empire had revolutionized artificial intelligence, making him one of the 10 wealthiest men in the world. Vivian wielded this influence like a weapon, her smile never reaching her eyes as she surveyed her domain. What Vivian failed to recognize was that Usha had navigated hostile environments her entire life. From being the only brown girl in her private school to facing skepticism in the hallowed halls of Yale Law, she had developed an inner resilience that couldn't be shaken by mere social slights. This quiet strength would soon be put to the ultimate test. The gala reached its pinnacle during the live auction, where the wealthy competed to demonstrate their generosity through ever-increasing bids for luxury experiences and rare collectibles. The grand finale was always the surprise item, a tradition that Vivian had personally curated for years. This year's offering was rumored to be particularly spectacular, and anticipation hung in the air like perfume. No one could have predicted how the evening would unravel from that moment forward. The subtle power play was about to explode into a public confrontation that would leave one woman humiliated and the other elevated to legendary status among New York's elite. In the high-stakes world of wealth and status, reputation is everything, and reputations can be destroyed in a single moment of hubris. The stage was set for a clash between old power and new influence, between inherited privilege and earned respect. The glittering ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum became the battlefield for a war fought with cutting words and surgical precision. And at the center of it all stood two women who represented fundamentally different visions of American success. Vivian Harlow had been born into privilege, her path smoothed by family connections and generational wealth. She viewed the social hierarchy as fixed and immutable, a natural order that properly positioned her at the top. Usha Vance had fought for every opportunity, overcoming barriers and bias through intellect and perseverance. Her very presence at the gala challenged Vivian's worldview in ways that couldn't be tolerated. As the auction reached its climax, tension crackled through the room like electricity before a storm. The champagne had loosened tongues, and Vivian's restraint was wearing dangerously thin. The inevitable confrontation drew closer with each passing minute, building toward a moment that would be recounted in hushed tones at every social gathering for years to come. What no one realized was that beneath Usha's calm exterior lay a strategic mind that had argued before the highest court in the land. She understood power dynamics better than anyone in the room, and she was prepared for whatever came next. The stage was set for a masterclass in grace under pressure, a response so perfectly calibrated that it would forever alter the social landscape. The night was young, the stakes were high, and two formidable women were on a collision course that would result in one of the most stunning social reversals in Manhattan history. When Vivian finally made her move, the resulting confrontation would become the stuff of legend, a cautionary tale about underestimating those you perceive as beneath you, and a triumphant reminder that true class cannot be bought or inherited. No one expected what would happen next, least of all Vivian Harlow, who believed her position was unassailable. But as the old saying goes, pride comes before a fall. And what a spectacular fall it would be. The Metropolitan Museum of Art had transformed for the evening into a wonderland of opulence and excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the Temple of Dendur, where ancient Egyptian architecture provided a dramatic backdrop for modern wealth. Floral arrangements of white orchids and pale roses adorned every surface, their delicate fragrance mingling with the scent of expensive perfumes. A string quartet played softly in the corner, their classical melodies floating above the gentle hum of privileged conversation. The annual Metropolitan Charity Gala represented the pinnacle of New York's social calendar, an exclusive gathering where admission started at $50,000 per plate. This year's theme, Renaissance of Compassion, seemed almost ironic given the barely concealed competition for status playing out beneath the museum's vaulted ceilings. Photographers circulated discreetly, capturing images that would grace society pages and social media feeds, immortalizing who stood with whom in the complex hierarchy of Manhattan's elite. The guest list read like a who's who of American power and influence. Tech billionaires mingled with old money families, Hollywood celebrities conversed with political power brokers, and fashion icons critiqued each other's couture choices with practiced subtlety. For those inside, the event reinforced their position at the top of society's pyramid. For those excluded, it represented a barrier they might never cross. Usha Vance arrived precisely at 8 o'clock, stepping from a black town car with understated elegance. Her midnight blue gown, designed by an up-and-coming Indian-American fashion designer, flowed around her like liquid silk. The high neckline and clean lines projected confidence and sophistication, while intricate gold embroidery along the hem paid subtle homage to her cultural heritage. Her dark hair was swept into a classic chignon, accentuating her sharp cheekbones and intelligent eyes. Unlike many of the women who had spent the day being pampered and prepared by teams of stylists, Usha had spent her morning volunteering at a legal aid clinic in Queens, helping immigrants navigate the complexity of American bureaucracy. She had changed into her gala attire with efficient precision, applying her own makeup with the skill of someone who had learned early in life to be self-sufficient. The diamond earrings she wore, her single concession to extravagance, had been a gift from her parents when she graduated law school first in her class. As she entered the grand space, heads turned, some in admiration, others in assessment, and a few in barely concealed resentment. Usha moved through the room with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and why she belonged, despite the whispers that followed in her wake. She accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter with a warm smile that momentarily flustered the young man, unused to genuine kindness from the gala's attendees. Across the room, Vivian Harlow held court among a circle of devoted admirers. At 45, she remained striking, her blonde hair cut in an expensive bob that framed a face maintained by the finest cosmetic surgeons in the country. Her crimson gown from a renowned French designer featured a plunging neckline adorned with rubies that matched her signature lipstick. The diamonds at her throat and wrists represented a small fortune, their brilliance calculated to remind everyone of her husband's incalculable wealth. Vivian's laugh, practiced and musical, carried across the room as she regaled her audience with an anecdote about her recent private audience with a European royal. Her influence stemmed not merely from her husband's billions, but from her carefully cultivated position as a tastemaker and gatekeeper. An invitation to one of her intimate dinners could launch a career. Exclusion could effectively end one. She wielded this power like a scalpel, precise and occasionally merciless. Between these two women stretched an invisible fault line of competing values and worldviews. Vivian represented old privilege, the belief that certain people were simply born to lead and others to follow. Usha embodied meritocracy, the idea that talent and hard work should determine one's place in society. Their inevitable collision was merely a matter of time and opportunity. The gala's first hour passed in a choreographed dance of social obligation. Guests circulated through the space, air-kissing acquaintances and engaging in the art of conversation without communication, discussing the weather, complimenting outfits, and exchanging harmless gossip, while avoiding any topic of substance or controversy. Champagne flowed freely, loosening tongues and lowering inhibitions as the evening progressed. Usha navigated this terrain with diplomatic skill, discussing education reform with a senator, debating recent Supreme Court decisions with a newspaper editor, and listening attentively as the museum's director explained the significance of the Temple of Dendur. Her genuine interest and incisive questions marked her as different from many of the attendees, who viewed such conversations merely as opportunities for self-promotion. From her position of prominence, Vivian observed Usha's movements with growing irritation. The newcomer was collecting admirers with disturbing ease, drawing attention that rightfully belonged to the gala's chairwoman. Each time Usha's thoughtful comment earned an appreciative nod or her subtle wit provoked genuine laughter, Vivian's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. The rubies at her throat seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her rising anger. As the dinner hour approached, guests began moving toward the elegantly appointed tables. The seating arrangement, orchestrated by Vivian herself, represented a complex calculation of power, wealth, and social standing. Those seated near the center enjoyed proximity to the most influential guests, while those relegated to peripheral tables received a clear message about their relative importance. Usha found her place card at table 3, close enough to the center to acknowledge her husband's political connections, but far enough away to signal her status as an outsider. She accepted this subtle slight with gracious equanimity, greeting her tablemates with genuine warmth as she took her seat. Among them was a renowned neurosurgeon, a philanthropist known for her work with refugee children, and a technology entrepreneur whose startup was revolutionizing clean water access in developing nations. Vivian, of course, presided over table 1, surrounded by billionaires, celebrities, and power brokers. The physical distance between the two women did nothing to diminish the growing tension. Throughout the elaborate 5-course meal prepared by a celebrity chef, Vivian's gaze repeatedly drifted toward Usha, her eyes narrowing slightly each time she observed the younger woman engaged in animated conversation with her table mates. The carefully orchestrated program proceeded according to schedule: a welcome speech from the museum director, a short film highlighting the gala's charitable initiatives, and a performance by a world-famous opera singer that brought the audience to its feet. Through it all, the invisible current of tension continued to build between the two women, perceived by those sensitive to the subtle dynamics of power and influence that governed their world. As coffee and dessert were served, guests began to circulate once more, preparing for the evening's main event, the charity auction that would determine the gala's financial success. Vivian rose from her seat with practiced grace, moving through the crowd to ensure every detail was perfect for the showcase of generosity to come. Her path deliberately took her past Usha's table, setting the stage for the first direct encounter between these opposing forces. The moment of collision was imminent. Two women representing fundamentally different visions of American success were about to meet in a confrontation that would reverberate through Manhattan's social circles for years to come. The assembled elite, attuned to the subtle shifts in the room's atmosphere, sensed the approaching drama and prepared to witness a clash of titans that would determine whose star would rise and whose would fall in the ruthless firmament of high society. The auction was about to begin when Vivian finally made her move. Gliding across the polished marble floor with predatory grace, she approached Usha just as the younger woman was engaged in conversation with the museum's chief curator about an upcoming exhibition of South Asian art. Vivian's timing was impeccable. She arrived at precisely the moment when interrupting would be most disruptive, ensuring maximum attention from those nearby. "Usha, darling," Vivian called out, her voice carrying just enough to attract the notice of surrounding guests. "I've been meaning to come say hello all evening. That's quite an interesting choice of dress." Her pause was deliberate, her smile never reaching her eyes as she assessed Usha's attire with a critical gaze. The curator, sensing the shift in atmosphere, murmured an excuse and discreetly withdrew. A small circle of space formed around the two women as nearby conversations quieted, the well-trained instincts of the social elite alerting them to impending drama. Usha turned to face Vivian with composed dignity. "Thank you, Vivian. Radhika Mehta is an extraordinary designer. I'm honored to wear her work." "Mehta? I don't believe I'm familiar with the name." Vivian's tone made it clear that unfamiliarity equated to insignificance in her world. "I suppose there's something charming about supporting unknown talent. Though at an event of this caliber, most of us prefer established designers who understand the traditions of proper society." The implicit criticism hung in the air like expensive perfume, subtle but unmistakable. Several onlookers exchanged glances, recognizing the opening salvo in what promised to be a masterclass in social warfare. "Innovation often comes from fresh perspectives," Usha replied evenly. "Radhika combines traditional Indian craftsmanship with contemporary American silhouettes. Her work embodies the cultural bridge that makes our country so unique." Vivian's perfectly maintained smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "How multicultural of you, though I've always found that respecting established traditions is the mark of true breeding. Those who belong naturally understand the value of conformity in certain circles." She gestured vaguely around the room, encompassing the gathering of America's elite. The subtext was clear to everyone within earshot. Usha was being branded an outsider, someone who fundamentally did not belong despite her invitation. It was a calculated insult, wrapped in the veneer of polite conversation, designed to diminish without crossing into outright rudeness. "The Gala committee was quite surprised by your husband's sizable donation this year," Vivian continued, shifting tactics smoothly. "Politics must be treating him well. It's always refreshing when new money demonstrates social consciousness, however belatedly." A few nervous titters sounded from the growing audience. Vivian's reference to new money was a classic form of social snobbery, implying that the Vance's success was recent and therefore somehow less legitimate than generational wealth. Usha maintained her composure, neither rising to the bait nor retreating from the challenge. "My husband and I believe deeply in the educational initiative this year's gala is supporting. Access to quality education transformed both our lives. We're simply paying it forward." "How admirable," Vivian responded with a dismissive wave of her hand, diamonds glittering at her wrist. "Though between us, there's been some concern about the guest list becoming rather diluted in recent years. The committee may need to reevaluate our invitation criteria for next season." The threat was thinly veiled. Vivian was suggesting that Usha's presence was a mistake that would not be repeated. By now, a significant portion of the room was observing the exchange while pretending not to. Vivian clearly relished the audience, her performance calculated for maximum impact among Manhattan's social arbiters. She had staged countless such takedowns over the years, establishing her dominance by publicly humiliating those she deemed unworthy. "I understand completely," Usha replied with surprising warmth. "Exclusivity has its place, though I've always found that diversity of perspective enriches any gathering. Perhaps that's my legal background. The strongest arguments emerge from the collision of different viewpoints." Vivian's eyes narrowed slightly at Usha's failure to be intimidated. This was not proceeding according to the familiar script, where the target either responded with anger, confirming their lack of breeding, or retreated in shame, validating Vivian's superior status. Legal background, Vivian repeated, her tone making the profession sound vaguely distasteful. Yes, I recall reading something about that. A clerkship, wasn't it? How industrious of you. Though most women in our circle find fulfillment in more traditional pursuits, charity work, supporting our husbands, preserving cultural standards. She gestured toward a nearby group of socialites, all of whom had married into their positions and spent their days planning luncheons and benefit galas. Each path has its value, Usha responded diplomatically. The beauty of American society is that women now have choices my mother's generation could only dream of. Some find purpose in traditional roles, others in professional achievement. There's no single correct way to contribute. Vivian's frustration at Usha's unflappable demeanor became increasingly evident in her stiffening posture and the slight flush spreading beneath her expertly applied makeup. The whispered commentary around them had grown, with several observers openly admiring Usha's grace under pressure. How very progressive of you, Vivian said, injecting the word with subtle disdain. Though I sometimes wonder if certain cultural backgrounds truly grasp the nuances of our society, particularly the unspoken rules that govern events like these. The racial undertone was unmistakable now, causing several onlookers to shift uncomfortably. Usha's expression remained serene, though something flashed briefly in her dark eyes, not anger, but a calculated assessment, as though she were analyzing an opponent's legal argument for weaknesses. Cultural nuance is fascinating, isn't it? My parents always emphasized the importance of understanding both the written and unwritten rules of any environment. It served me well from Yale Law to the Supreme Court. The strategic mention of her prestigious credentials was delivered so naturally that it didn't sound like bragging, merely a relevant observation. Several members of the audience registered the impressive accomplishments with raised eyebrows and newfound respect. Vivian's smile had become a brittle thing, strained at the edges, as she realized her usual tactics were failing to land. Well, isn't that lovely for you? Though I've always found that true belonging isn't about credentials or achievements. It's about heritage, lineage, a certain innate understanding that simply can't be acquired through education alone. The auction announcer's voice cut through the tension, calling guests to take their seats for the bidding to begin. Vivian seized the opportunity for a strategic retreat, though not without a parting shot. We should continue this charming conversation later, Usha dear. Do enjoy the auction, though the bidding typically reaches levels that might be surprising for those not accustomed to our circle's standards of philanthropy. With a final dismissive glance at Usha's gown, she turned and moved toward the center of the room, her crimson dress cutting through the crowd like a shark through water. Usha remained poised, accepting a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter with a genuine smile of thanks. Though the initial skirmish had concluded without clear victory for either side, the assembled witnesses understood that this was merely the opening exchange in what promised to be a memorable battle of wills. The auction proceeded with the practiced efficiency of an event where the participants understood both the explicit and implicit rules of engagement. A professional auctioneer from a prestigious auction house guided the proceedings, his British accent lending an air of distinguished authority as he coaxed ever higher bids from the assembled wealthy. The initial offerings, luxury vacation packages, exclusive dining experiences with celebrity chefs, private concerts by renowned musicians, each drew spirited bidding that pushed the totals well into six figures. Throughout the proceedings, Vivian maintained her position of prominence near the auctioneer's podium, periodically raising her auction paddle to set a standard of generosity that others felt compelled to match or exceed. Each time she secured an item with a winning bid, she would turn slightly to ensure her triumph was visible to all, particularly to Usha, who remained seated at her table, observing the spectacle with thoughtful attention. As the auction progressed, Vivian's bidding became increasingly aggressive, driving prices to unprecedented levels with bold increments that elicited gasps from the audience. Her performance was calculated to demonstrate not merely wealth, but dominance, a reminder to all present of the Harlow family's unassailable position at the pinnacle of New York society. Next, we have a truly exceptional opportunity, the auctioneer announced, his voice dropping to a reverent hush. A private dinner for 8 prepared by 3 Michelin-starred chef Jean-Pierre Blanc in his yet-to-open Manhattan restaurant with wine pairings selected from his legendary cellar. This exclusive experience will not be available to the public for at least 6 months. Shall we start the bidding at $20,000? Vivian's paddle rose immediately, her ruby bracelet catching the light as she established her interest. The bidding escalated rapidly, with several determined contenders dropping out as the price surpassed $50,000. When only one other bidder remained, a tech entrepreneur whose recent IPO had catapulted him into the billionaire class, Vivian's expression hardened with competitive resolve. $100,000, she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the now hushed room. It was an aggressive jump designed to intimidate her opponent into submission. The tech entrepreneur hesitated momentarily before reluctantly lowering his paddle in surrender. Vivian's triumphant smile as she secured the winning bid held more than a hint of predatory satisfaction. Sold to Mrs. Harlow for $100,000, the auctioneer confirmed, unable to completely mask his surprise at the extraordinary sum for what was essentially an elaborate dinner party. Your generosity continues to set the standard for this event, madam. Vivian inclined her head in acknowledgement of the compliment, her gaze sweeping the room to absorb the admiration of her peers. When her eyes fell on Usha, however, she was disconcerted to find the younger woman engaged in quiet conversation with the neurosurgeon at her table, apparently unmoved by Vivian's display of financial firepower. This subtle dismissal of her moment of triumph pricked at Vivian's carefully maintained composure. She had expected, required, Usha's acknowledgement of her superior status. The absence of such recognition represented an intolerable breach of the social order Vivian had spent decades establishing and enforcing. And now, ladies and gentlemen, the auctioneer continued, we come to our special surprise offering, a tradition of the Metropolitan Gala that always generates extraordinary excitement. This year's surprise has been personally arranged by our chairwoman, Mrs. Vivian Harlow. At this announcement, Vivian moved to join the auctioneer at the podium, her crimson gown catching the light as she assumed center stage. The room quieted in anticipation, all eyes focused on the woman who had ruled Manhattan's social scene with an iron grip disguised in silk gloves. Thank you all for your remarkable generosity this evening, Vivian began, her practiced public speaking voice projecting effortlessly across the grand space. The final offering tonight represents something truly unique, an opportunity I have personally secured that is unavailable at any price under normal circumstances. She paused dramatically, savoring the rapt attention of the assembled elite. Through my connections at the United Nations, I have arranged for the winning bidder to host a private diplomatic reception at the UN General Assembly Hall. This unprecedented event will include a receiving line of ambassadors from 15 nations, a private tour of chambers normally closed to the public, and the opportunity to address assembled dignitaries on an educational initiative of your choosing. A murmur of impressed surprise rippled through the audience. Such access to the inner sanctum of international diplomacy was indeed extraordinary, the sort of experience that conferred not merely pleasure, but prestige and influence. This opportunity represents the perfect alignment of philanthropy and social significance, Vivian continued, her gaze now deliberately fixing on Usha. Of course, such an occasion demands a certain diplomatic sophistication, the ability to move comfortably among world leaders and represent our nation's finest traditions with appropriate breeding and background. The targeted nature of this comment was not lost on the audience. Several heads turned subtly toward Usha, awaiting her reaction to this thinly veiled suggestion that someone of her background would be unsuitable for such a rarefied opportunity. We'll open the bidding at $50,000, the auctioneer interjected smoothly, perhaps sensing the dangerously personal turn the proceedings had taken. Paddles rose across the room as the wealthy competed for this unique prize. The figure quickly surpassed 100,000, then 200,000, as the field narrowed to a handful of determined bidders. Vivian watched with satisfaction as the price climbed, her gaze periodically returning to Usha, who remained engaged in conversation with her tablemates, seemingly indifferent to the auction's progress. This apparent disinterest fueled Vivian's growing irritation. Her carefully orchestrated moment of triumph was being undermined by Usha's refusal to participate in the established ritual of competition and submission that maintained the social hierarchy. As the bidding reached $300,000, a surprising voice cut through the excitement. 500,000. The room fell silent as heads turned toward the source of this bold jump. Usha Vance stood calmly, auction paddle raised, her expression serene despite the audacity of her bid. Vivian's carefully composed facade cracked momentarily, her eyes widening in shock before she quickly reasserted control over her features. This unexpected development represented not merely competition, but direct challenge, a rejection of the carefully constructed boundaries that kept outsiders firmly in their designated place. $500,000 from Mrs. Vance, the auctioneer confirmed, unable to completely mask his surprise. Do I hear 550,000? The room remained silent, most bidders recognizing that the auction had transformed from a charitable exercise into a proxy battle between two formidable women. The astronomical sum had effectively eliminated casual participants, leaving only those willing to enter a high-stakes contest of wealth and will. 550,000, called a voice from near the front. Richard Harlow had joined the fray, his deep voice projecting authority as he raised his paddle. His intervention made the nature of the conflict explicit. The Harlows united against the upstart challenger. The tension in the room intensified palpably as guests exchanged glances of disbelief and excitement. The Metropolitan Gala had witnessed many displays of competitive philanthropy over the years, but never one so nakedly personal as the drama now unfolding before them. 600,000, Usha countered without hesitation, her voice steady and confident. The gasp that swept through the room was audible, the collective intake of breath from hundreds of witnesses to what had become an unprecedented public confrontation between established power and emerging influence. A charged silence descended upon the grand hall as all eyes flickered between Usha and the Harlows. The battle lines had been unmistakably drawn, transforming what had begun as subtle social warfare into open conflict. Richard Harlow leaned toward his wife, whispering something in her ear that caused Vivian's expression to harden. The couple presented a united front of established wealth and power, their decades of social dominance suddenly threatened by this unexpected challenger. 700,000, Richard announced, his deep voice carrying an edge of irritation that revealed the bid was no longer merely philanthropic, but personal. His hand rested possessively on Vivian's shoulder, diamonds and rubies glittering under the chandeliers as husband and wife stood together against the perceived interloper. The auctioneer, sensing the unusual tension, maintained his professional demeanor with visible effort. $700,000 from Mr. Harlow. Do I hear 750,000? Usha remained standing, her posture relaxed, yet dignified. Unlike the Harlows, whose rigid stances betrayed their mounting frustration, she appeared almost serene amid the escalating conflict. She exchanged a brief glance with the neurosurgeon seated beside her, who gave an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. 800,000, Usha stated clearly, her voice carrying through the hushed room without strain or hesitation. The precision of her increments, advancing in $100,000 steps rather than the customary 50,000, sent an unmistakable message. She was prepared to pursue this, to whatever conclusion necessary. A ripple of shocked murmurs spread through the assembled guests. The Metropolitan Gala had seen impressive displays of wealth before, but rarely had the auction taken on such a nakedly competitive dimension. This was no longer about acquiring the prize, but about establishing dominance in a social hierarchy suddenly thrown into question. Richard Harlow's face flushed with barely contained anger. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, particularly in what he considered his home territory. The tech billionaire had built his fortune by eliminating competitors with ruthless efficiency, and his approach to social standing was equally uncompromising. He leaned down once more to confer with Vivian, their urgent whispers just audible enough to convey their distress without revealing specific content. $1 million, Richard announced after a moment, emphasizing each word as though the sheer weight of the sum would crush any further resistance. His declaration was accompanied by a dismissive glance toward Usha, as if to say that surely this would end her presumptuous challenge. The collective gasp that swept through the room was immediate and visceral. Even among this gathering of exceptional wealth, $1 million bid represented an extraordinary statement. Several guests began recording discreetly on their phones, recognizing that they were witnessing a moment that would be discussed in Manhattan social circles for years to come. The auctioneer, momentarily stunned by the escalation, quickly recovered his professional composure. $1 million from Mr. Harlow. Ladies and gentlemen, this is unprecedented generosity for our cause. He turned toward Usha with an expression that suggested he expected her withdrawal from the contest. Madam, do I hear any advance on $1 million? All attention focused on Usha, whose composed expression had not wavered despite the extraordinary pressure of the moment. The silence stretched for several seconds as she appeared to consider her response carefully. Vivian's lips curved into the beginning of a triumphant smile, anticipating the submission she had engineered through her husband's financial firepower. $1,001, Usha stated calmly, the precision of her bid drawing surprised laughter from several corners of the room. The seemingly modest increment carried a devastating message. She was not intimidated by the Harlows' wealth and was prepared to continue this contest with surgical precision rather than brute financial force. The laughter that greeted her bid struck Vivian like physical blows. Her carefully cultivated image as the unassailable queen of Manhattan society was being undermined not merely by Usha's continued resistance, but by the audience's growing admiration for the challenger's composure and strategic thinking. This is absurd, Vivian hissed to her husband, her voice just loud enough to be heard by those nearby. She's turning this into a circus. Her perfectly manicured nails dug into Richard's arm, urging him to escalate further. Richard Harlow's expression had darkened to a dangerous degree. The tech mogul was accustomed to crushing opposition through overwhelming financial advantage, but Usha's calculated response had effectively neutralized this tactic by signaling her willingness to continue indefinitely with minimal increments. $2 million, he announced abruptly, his voice carrying a dangerous edge that silenced the remaining murmurs and laughter. This was no longer merely a bid, but a statement of absolute authority, a line drawn that none could be expected to cross. The auctioneer, visibly uncomfortable with the increasingly personal nature of the bidding war, turned toward Usha with an expression that bordered on pleading. The charitable purpose of the event had been eclipsed by what had become an unmistakable power struggle, and his professional instincts urged him to find a graceful conclusion. Before he could speak, however, Usha stunned the room yet again. $2,001, she stated, her voice carrying the precise clarity of a courtroom argument. Then, adding an unprecedented dimension to the proceedings, she continued, "And I would like to propose a modification to the prize, if I may." This unexpected development drew confused glances between the auctioneer and Vivian, who remained frozen in a posture of incredulous outrage. "I propose that rather than a single diplomatic reception, the prize be expanded to host a series of educational forums at the United Nations, bringing students from underserved communities to interact with world leaders and diplomats. My bid would fund not one exclusive event, but a program that could impact thousands of young people who would never otherwise access such opportunities." A moment of stunned silence was followed by spontaneous applause from several corners of the room. Usha had masterfully transformed the contest from a battle of personal wealth to a question of philanthropic vision, effectively changing the rules of engagement mid-game. The museum director, sensing both opportunity and danger in the unprecedented situation, stepped forward to join the auctioneer at the podium. "What an extraordinary suggestion, Mrs. Vance. The educational mission of our gala would indeed be powerfully served by such an expansion of the original concept." Vivian's expression contorted with barely contained fury as she recognized the strategic brilliance of Usha's move. By recasting the prize in more inclusive terms, she had placed the Harlows in an impossible position. To continue bidding against her would appear not as generous philanthropy, but as selfish determination to monopolize an opportunity that could benefit thousands. "Perhaps," the museum director continued diplomatically, "this remarkable development presents an opportunity for collaboration rather than competition. would the Harlows and Mrs. Vance consider joining forces to create this expanded educational program, combining their considerable resources and influence for maximum impact? Richard Harlow's expression remained thunderous, but Vivian, ever attuned to the shifting winds of social perception, recognized the director's suggestion as the only face-saving option available. To refuse would permanently damage their carefully cultivated image as civic-minded philanthropists. Of course, Vivian managed through a smile that resembled a grimace. The Harlow Foundation has always prioritized educational access. We would be delighted to collaborate with Mrs. Vance on this initiative. Each word seemed extracted under duress, her tone belying the generous content of her statement. Usha inclined her head graciously, neither gloating nor retreating. Education transformed my life. I'm honored to work alongside the Harlows to extend similar opportunities to students who might otherwise be overlooked by traditional philanthropy. The assembled guests erupted in enthusiastic applause, relieved and exhilarated by the resolution of the high-stakes confrontation. The narrative had been reshaped before their eyes, from personal conflict to philanthropic partnership, from exclusive privilege to inclusive opportunity. Only those closest to Vivian could see the cold calculation in her eyes as she maintained her strained smile for the benefit of watching phones and society photographers. This unexpected humiliation would not go unanswered. The battle had not concluded. It had merely shifted to a different, more private arena where the rules of engagement might prove less favorable to Usha's strategic brilliance. As the auction concluded with the unprecedented $2 million collaborative pledge, the atmosphere in the grand hall underwent a subtle but significant transformation. What had begun as a traditional society gathering had become something more volatile and unpredictable. The carefully maintained facade of unified elite civility had cracked, revealing the raw power dynamics that truly governed Manhattan's social hierarchy. Guests moved through the space with heightened awareness, gravitating toward either Vivian or Usha in a visible declaration of allegiance that would have lasting implications in the weeks and months to come. Vivian maintained her chairwoman's duties with rigid professionalism, though the warmth had drained from her social performance. Her smile remained fixed in place, but those who knew her well recognized the dangerous glint in her eyes, the look that had preceded the systematic social destruction of previous challengers to her authority. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, accepting congratulations for the record-breaking fundraising total while strategically redirecting any mention of Usha's contribution. "Such an unusual approach to philanthropy," she remarked to the publisher of New York's most influential society magazine. "Though I suppose we must make allowances for those unfamiliar with established traditions. The Harlow Foundation will ensure the program maintains appropriate standards despite its unconventional origins." The publisher nodded thoughtfully, recognizing both the quote she was being handed for her next issue and the opening salvo in what promised to be a fascinating social war. Manhattan's elite thrived on such conflicts. They provided the narrative tension that made their privileged existence feel consequential rather than merely comfortable. Across the room, Usha found herself surrounded by guests eager to make her acquaintance. The auction confrontation had transformed her from an interesting outsider to a central character in the social drama. Many approached out of genuine admiration for her composure and vision, while others, more pragmatic in their social calculations, recognized the emergence of a potential new power center worth cultivating. "Your educational initiative is inspired," commented the university president who had previously paid little attention to Usha. "We should discuss potential partnership opportunities with our global studies program." "I've always found the UN's approach to educational access somewhat limited by bureaucratic constraints," offered a silver-haired diplomat who had earlier been firmly in Vivian's orbit. "Your fresh perspective could be transformative. Perhaps we could meet for lunch next week to explore some ideas." Usha accepted these overtures with genuine grace, neither gloating over her effective challenge to the established order nor appearing overwhelmed by her sudden prominence. She engaged thoughtfully with each conversation, focusing on the substance of the educational initiative rather than the social dynamics that had brought it into being. "The real opportunity lies in creating sustainable pathways between diplomatic institutions and underserved schools," she explained to a cluster of interested guests. Many brilliant young minds never consider international relations as a career path, simply because they've never been exposed to its possibilities. As these conversations unfolded, Richard Harlow observed from a strategic distance, his expression unreadable as he assessed the shifting social currents. Unlike his wife, whose power stemmed primarily from social capital, Richard's influence derived from his billions and the fear they inspired in a world increasingly shaped by technology. He recognized in Usha not merely a social rival, but a more fundamental challenge to the system of privilege he had manipulated so successfully. The evening's scheduled program continued with the traditional post-auction entertainment, a performance by a renowned cellist that would normally have commanded complete attention. Tonight, however, the music served primarily as backdrop to the far more compelling human drama playing out among the tables. Conversations continued in hushed tones, analyzing the confrontation from every angle and speculating about its implications for the delicate ecosystem of influence and access that governed their world. "Vivian miscalculated badly," whispered a hedge fund manager to his companion. "She didn't realize that immigrants' children are often more strategic than we are. They've had to navigate multiple worlds from birth." "The Harlows aren't accustomed to resistance," replied his wife, a third-generation socialite who had witnessed decades of Manhattan power struggles. "They've crushed everyone who's challenged them before. This won't end tonight." Similar conversations multiplied throughout the room, creating a low murmur that periodically rose above the cellist's passionate interpretation of Bach. The guests were simultaneously audience and participants in a drama that reflected broader tensions in American society, between established power and emerging influence, between inherited privilege and earned achievement, between exclusivity and inclusion. As the performance concluded and guests began preparing for departure, the museum director made his way to Usha's side, navigating through her newfound admirers with practiced diplomatic skill. "Mrs. Vance, I want to personally thank you for your extraordinary contribution this evening," he began, his voice pitched to ensure privacy amid the surrounding conversations. "Not merely financial, but conceptual. Your vision for expanding the UN program aligns beautifully with our institution's evolving mission." Usha acknowledged his thanks with a modest nod. "The Metropolitan Museum has always represented the highest aspirations of American culture. I'm honored to contribute to its legacy in some small way." The director hesitated momentarily before continuing, choosing his words with careful precision. "I should perhaps mention that the Gala committee has operated under Mrs. Harlow's guidance for many years. Her approach has been tremendously successful in financial terms, though perhaps increasingly misaligned with contemporary values regarding inclusion and access." The subtext was clear even without explicit statement. The museum leadership recognized the changing social landscape and was recalibrating its allegiances accordingly. Usha's challenge to the established order had revealed fault lines that had been developing beneath the surface for some time. "Institutions evolve just as societies do," Usha responded diplomatically. "The challenge lies in honoring valuable traditions while embracing necessary change." The director nodded appreciatively at her nuanced response. "We're forming a strategic planning committee for next year's gala. Your perspective would be invaluable, should you be willing to serve." The invitation represented a seismic shift in the power dynamics of Manhattan philanthropy. The Gala committee had been Vivian's exclusive domain for half a decade, her personal fiefdom within the broader landscape of social influence. For the museum director to suggest Usha's inclusion was nothing short of revolutionary. Before Usha could respond, the moment was interrupted by the sharp sound of breaking glass. Heads turned toward the source of the disturbance. Vivian Harlow stood frozen in place, champagne spreading across the marble floor from the shattered flute at her feet. Her gaze was fixed on Usha and the museum director, her expression revealing that she had observed their conversation and intuited its significance. For a brief, electric moment, the carefully maintained veneer of civility threatened to collapse entirely. Vivian's face contorted with an emotion too raw for the refined setting, a combination of fury, humiliation, and dawning recognition that her long-established position might truly be at risk. The museum director shifted uncomfortably under Vivian's glare, but Usha remained composed, meeting the older woman's gaze with neither challenge nor submission. The silent exchange between them communicated volumes that words could never adequately express. An acknowledgement that the evening's confrontation had altered the social landscape in ways that would reverberate far beyond the museum's walls. Richard Harlow appeared at his wife's side with practiced efficiency, placing a steadying hand on her arm and signaling to an attendant to address the broken glass. His intervention prevented complete social catastrophe, but the damage had been done. Dozens of witnesses had observed Vivian's momentary loss of control, an unforgivable breach in a world where power was expressed through perfect composure rather than naked emotion. As attendants rushed to clean the spill and restore order, conversations resumed at increased volume, analyzing this latest development with the precision of professional critics. The narrative of the evening had acquired an unexpected final act, one that confirmed the fundamental shift in power that many had begun to sense, but few had dared to articulate. The Metropolitan Gala was drawing to its conclusion, but the social drama it had unleashed was only beginning. As guests collected their coats and waited for their drivers, the evening's events were already being disseminated through text messages and phone calls to those not fortunate enough to have witnessed them firsthand. By morning, Usha's challenge and Vivian's response would be the primary topic of conversation in penthouses and private clubs throughout the city. The Harlow penthouse occupied the top 3 floors of a limestone building on Fifth Avenue, directly across from Central Park. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered panoramic views of Manhattan's manicured heart, the city spread below like a personal fiefdom. Tonight, however, neither Richard nor Vivian spared a glance for the glittering vista as they entered their private elevator, maintaining rigid silence until the doors closed behind them. "That immigrant nobody humiliated us in front of everyone who matters in this city," Vivian hissed the moment they were alone, her composure shattering like the champagne flute she had dropped. She yanked off her diamond earrings with trembling fingers, her carefully applied makeup creasing as she contorted her face in undisguised rage. Richard Harlow loosened his bow tie with practiced efficiency, his expression controlled yet dangerous. Unlike his wife, whose power stemmed from social manipulation, Richard had built his fortune through ruthless strategic calculation. He did not waste energy on emotional outbursts, but channeled his anger into methodical problem-solving. "She outmaneuvered you," he stated flatly, the bluntness of his assessment drawing a sharp glare from Vivian. "You underestimated her because of her background. A strategic error I would have expected from an amateur, not from you." The elevator arrived at their penthouse with a discreet chime. Richard strode directly to the bar, pouring himself 3 fingers of 30-year-old scotch without offering Vivian a drink, a subtle punishment for her mishandling of the evening. "That self-righteous diversity hire thinks she can step into my world and rewrite the rules?" Vivian paced across Italian marble floors, her crimson gown trailing behind her like spilled blood. "Do you know what Ainsley just told me? The museum director invited her to join next year's gala committee, my committee." Richard swirled his scotch thoughtfully, already mentally mapping potential responses to the evening's setback. "Usha Vance is not merely an immigrant's daughter with a law degree. She clerked for the Chief Justice, worked at Gibson Dunn, and maintains connections throughout Washington's power structure. Her husband's political trajectory is impressive by any standard. Dismissing her as an inconsequential diversity symbol was your first mistake." Vivian's eyes flashed dangerously at her husband's criticism. Their marriage had always been a partnership of complementary ambitions, her social engineering aligned with his financial dominance to create a fortress of privilege seemingly impervious to outside challenge. For decades, this arrangement had functioned with mechanical precision. Tonight's events had revealed unexpected vulnerabilities in their carefully constructed system. "The museum director is a spineless opportunist," she snapped, kicking off her designer heels with uncharacteristic carelessness. "He's been happy to benefit from our patronage and connections for years. The moment someone offers a competing vision, he hedges his bets like the institutional bureaucrat he is." "Institutions are adapting to changing demographics and values," Richard noted dispassionately. "They recognize that power is diversifying, even if we prefer it wouldn't. The museum needs donors who reflect the America of tomorrow, not just yesterday's establishment." Vivian stopped her pacing to stare at her husband incredulously. "Are you suggesting we simply surrender our position to these newcomers, That we stand aside while everything we've built is dismantled by people who haven't earned their place? Richard's laugh held no humor. I'm suggesting we adapt our strategy to address the actual threat, not the caricature you've constructed in your mind. Usha Vance isn't attacking the system. She's demonstrating her mastery of it. That makes her far more dangerous than a simple outsider. He crossed to his private study, Vivian following close behind as he unlocked a hidden panel revealing a state-of-the-art computer system. With a few keystrokes, he accessed proprietary databases unavailable to the public or even to most financial institutions. "What are you doing?" Vivian asked, her anger temporarily displaced by curiosity. "Knowledge is leverage," Richard replied, fingers flying across the keyboard. "If we're going to neutralize this threat, we need to understand exactly who we're dealing with. Not your simplified version of Usha Vance, but the actual woman, her strengths, her vulnerabilities, her pressure points." Information began populating multiple screens: financial records, educational history, professional achievements, personal connections, social media activity, meticulously aggregated and analyzed. Richard's technology empire had built its fortune on data mining and pattern recognition, capabilities he had long applied to his personal adversaries as well as his corporate competitors. "Interesting," he murmured as he scanned the emerging profile. Her parents mortgaged everything they owned to fund her education. First-generation immigrant achievement ethic, perfect academic record, Supreme Court clerkship, married her law school classmate. No children yet, though they've been trying, according to medical records from their insurance claims. Vivian moved closer, her strategic mind finally engaging with the problem analytically rather than emotionally. Personal vulnerabilities? Richard continued scrolling through the data. Her parents still live modestly in Ohio despite her success. Father developed coronary issues last year, mother active in local immigrant support organizations. Usha sends them 30% of her income monthly. Deeply family-oriented, which tracks with her cultural background. Professional vulnerabilities? More limited. Her legal career is impeccable. No ethics complaints, no controversial cases. She specialized in constitutional law and international human rights, strategic choices for someone with political ambitions. Richard paused, studying a particular document more closely. However, her husband's political funding comes primarily from a relatively narrow base of supporters. Their combined net worth is substantial, but not extraordinary by our standards. They've leveraged connections more than capital to achieve their current position. Vivian absorbed this information with calculating precision, her earlier rage transforming into focused determination. So they're financially solid, but not invulnerable. Deeply ethical, at least publicly. Family-oriented with strong immigrant values. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. "I can work with that." Richard recognized the expression. It had preceded the systematic destruction of previous challengers to their position. "What are you thinking?" "The UN Educational Initiative provides perfect cover," Vivian replied, her social strategist's mind formulating a multi-layered attack. "We'll publicly embrace the partnership, while privately ensuring it becomes a liability for her. I'll activate my contacts at the UN to create bureaucratic obstacles she'll have to navigate personally. Meanwhile, we'll launch our own separate educational foundation with significantly greater resources, positioning hers as a well-meaning but ultimately inadequate effort." Richard nodded appreciatively at the approach. Social isolation combined with professional undermining, classic Vivian Harlow technique. "Additionally," Vivian continued, warming to her strategy, "I'll schedule our next major event to conflict directly with her parents' anniversary, the 45th according to your data. Force her to choose between family obligation and social advancement. Either choice damages her in different ways." "And if that proves insufficient?" Richard asked, always the pragmatist. Vivian's expression hardened. "Then we activate our media contacts. Nothing overtly critical. That would generate sympathy. Instead, we'll ensure she receives overwhelming positive coverage, specifically highlighting her as a diversity success story. Every article will subtly emphasize her otherness, her exceptional status as someone who transcended her background. We'll praise her into the box we want her confined within." Richard studied his wife with renewed appreciation for her psychological acumen. Where he might have deployed financial pressure directly, Vivian understood the more nuanced approach necessary for this particular adversary. The praise trap, he noted, celebration as containment. Precisely, Vivian confirmed. We'll publicly champion her as the perfect example of American meritocracy, while privately ensuring that every door she tries to open requires our key. She'll either become dependent on our approval or be isolated as ungrateful when she resists our patronage. The strategy session continued late into the night, husband and wife methodically plotting the social, financial, and psychological containment of the woman who had dared to challenge their authority. Their approach combined Richard's data-driven precision with Vivian's sophisticated understanding of social dynamics, a formidable alliance that had maintained their position at the pinnacle of New York society for decades. What neither acknowledged, even to themselves, was the undercurrent of fear driving their extensive response. Usha Vance represented more than an individual challenger. She embodied a changing America where traditional power structures were increasingly vulnerable to new forms of influence. Their elaborate counterattack reflected not merely personal animosity, but existential anxiety about their continued relevance in a rapidly evolving social landscape. As dawn broke over Manhattan, illuminating the penthouse with golden light, the Harlows finally retired to separate bedrooms, confident in their comprehensive strategy, yet haunted by the unfamiliar sensation of genuine threat. For the first time in their long reign, they faced an adversary whose strengths directly targeted their vulnerabilities: intelligence against arrogance, authenticity against pretense, inclusive vision against exclusive privilege. The battle for Manhattan's social soul had only just begun, and its outcome remained far from certain. The morning after the Metropolitan Gala dawned bright and clear, sunlight streaming through the windows of Usha's brownstone in the West Village. Unlike the Harlows' palatial penthouse, the Vance home reflected different priorities: warmth over ostentation, comfort over status. Books lined custom shelves, framed photographs documented travels to various continents, and artwork from emerging artists added vibrant color to the historic architecture. It was a home designed for living rather than showcasing, though no less carefully curated for its understated elegance. Usha sat at the kitchen island with her tablet, scanning through the barrage of messages that had arrived since the previous evening. Her inbox had exploded overnight, filled with congratulations, partnership proposals, and invitations to events that had previously been closed to her. Manhattan's social ecosystem was recalibrating in real time, adjusting to the tectonic shift she had inadvertently triggered at the gala. "Your social stock appears to be rising," observed James Vance as he placed a cup of cardamom-spiced tea in front of his wife. Tall and thoughtful, with the measured demeanor of a career diplomat, James had watched the previous night's events with quiet admiration for his wife's composed handling of a difficult situation. "Social capital is the most volatile currency in Manhattan," Usha replied, sipping her tea gratefully. "It can evaporate as quickly as it materializes." James leaned against the counter, studying his wife's expression. "You knew exactly what you were doing last night, didn't you? The counter-proposal for the UN program wasn't spontaneous." Usha smiled slightly. "I anticipated Vivian might force a confrontation. The auction simply provided a more public forum than I expected." She scrolled through another batch of messages before setting the tablet aside. "The Harlows have controlled access to civic engagement in this city for too long. Their philanthropy is designed primarily to reinforce existing power structures rather than create genuine opportunity." James nodded thoughtfully. "And now you've positioned yourself as a credible alternative, someone with the vision and resources to challenge their monopoly on social good." He poured his own coffee, adding, "The Harlows won't accept this repositioning without a fight." "I'm counting on it," Usha replied with unexpected steel in her voice. "Their resistance will reveal exactly who they are and what they truly value." Their conversation was interrupted by a text message that caused Usha's eyebrows to rise in surprise. "Catherine Blackwell wants to meet for coffee this morning." James let out a low whistle. "The New York Times social columnist? That's fast, even by Manhattan standards." "The Times has always maintained a complex relationship with the Harlows," Usha noted, already typing her response. "Vivian cultivates journalists carefully, but Catherine has occasionally published pieces that subtly question the concentration of philanthropic influence among a narrow segment of society." An hour later, Usha was seated at a discreet corner table in a West Village cafe that prided itself on respecting the privacy of its notable clientele. Catherine Blackwell arrived precisely on time, her signature black-framed glasses, an immaculate bob, identifying her immediately to those familiar with her byline photo. "Thank you for making time on such short notice," Catherine began after ordering an espresso. "Last night's gala produced the most interesting social dynamics I've observed in years." Usha smiled diplomatically. "I'm glad the event was successful in raising funds for educational initiatives. That's ultimately what matters most." Catherine's expression indicated she wasn't accepting this modest deflection. "Mrs. Vance, may I call you Usha? We both know that last night represented something far more significant than a fundraising total. You directly challenged the established social hierarchy and emerged not merely unscathed, but strengthened. That simply doesn't happen in Vivian Harlow's carefully controlled world." Usha considered her response carefully, aware that this conversation would likely appear, in some form, in the Sunday Times. "Perhaps it's time for philanthropic leadership that reflects the diversity and dynamism of New York itself. Exclusive models of civic engagement may have served a purpose in previous eras, but they're increasingly misaligned with contemporary realities." Catherine nodded, jotting a note in her small leather-bound notebook. "You're suggesting the Harlow approach is obsolete?" "I'm suggesting that complementary approaches can coexist," Usha clarified, maintaining diplomatic precision. "Traditional philanthropy has accomplished meaningful good, but emerging models that emphasize broader participation and more diverse perspectives can address blind spots in the existing system." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Catherine probing Usha's vision for the UN Educational Initiative and her broader perspectives on civic leadership. Throughout, Usha maintained a careful balance, articulating clear principles without directly criticizing the Harlows, advocating for change without positioning herself as a revolutionary. As they were preparing to leave, Catherine asked a final question. "There are rumors that you've been invited to join next year's gala committee. Would you confirm this development?" Usha's slight hesitation revealed her surprise at how quickly this information had circulated. "The museum director expressed interest in my participation, but formal arrangements haven't been finalized. I'm honored by the consideration and would welcome the opportunity to contribute to such an important cultural institution." Catherine's knowing smile suggested she recognized the carefully crafted response for what it was: confirmation without detail, acknowledgement without commitment. "I expect we'll be seeing much more of you in contexts previously dominated by established figures like Vivian Harlow. Manhattan's social architecture appears to be undergoing a significant renovation." As they parted outside the cafe, Usha was aware of being photographed by someone across the street, likely a social media reporter for one of the numerous digital publications that chronicled Manhattan's elite. The image would be circulating within minutes, further evidence of her emerging status within the city's complex ecosystem of influence and access. Rather than returning home immediately, Usha chose to walk to Washington Square Park, using the movement to process her thoughts before her next appointment. The conversation with Catherine Blackwell had confirmed her assessment of the previous night's impact. The challenge to Vivian's authority had resonated far beyond the immediate context, tapping into existing currents of dissatisfaction with the closed system of Manhattan philanthropy. Her phone buzzed with a message from the museum director, confirming their meeting the following day to discuss the gala committee and requesting permission to include several board members who had expressed interest in meeting her. The institutional machinery was already adapting to the new reality, recognizing potential shifts in the landscape of patronage and influence. Another notification appeared, an email from the UN Undersecretary for Educational Initiatives expressing enthusiasm about her proposed program and suggesting an expedited timeline for implementation. The message included a pointed reference to refreshing alternatives to traditional approaches that left little doubt about the organization's eagerness to diversify its donor relationships beyond the Harlow Foundation's long-standing monopoly. As Usha navigated these rapidly multiplying opportunities, a part of her remained vigilant for the Harlows' inevitable counterattack. Their decades of accumulated influence couldn't be redirected overnight, and their extensive network provided countless avenues for subtle sabotage. The messages of support currently flooding her inbox could vanish as quickly as they had appeared if the Harlows activated their considerable resources against her. What the Harlows couldn't know, what few people understood about Usha Vance, was that she had been preparing for this moment since her first encounters with entrenched power structures during her law school days. The auction confrontation hadn't been an impulsive challenge, but the carefully considered first move in a longer strategic engagement. Where Vivian saw an upstart to be crushed, Usha recognized systemic vulnerabilities to be methodically addressed. The game was far from over. In fact, it had barely begun. And unlike previous challengers to the Harlows' dominance, Usha wasn't playing for individual advancement within the existing system, but for fundamental transformation of the system itself. Her ultimate goal wasn't to replace Vivian Harlow as Manhattan's social arbitrator, but to render such exclusive gatekeeping obsolete in a more inclusive model of civic engagement. As she crossed Washington Square Park, Usha noticed a young woman of South Asian descent sketching the arch while seated on a bench. Something about the student's focused determination reminded Usha of herself 20 years earlier, an outsider with ambition, talent, and the resilience forged through navigating spaces not designed for her presence. It was for this next generation, not for personal status, that the confrontation with the Harlows ultimately mattered. With renewed clarity of purpose, Usha checked her watch and turned toward her next destination. The board of the Children's Education Access Initiative had requested a meeting to discuss potential collaboration with her UN program. Another opportunity, another strategic positioning, another small step toward reconfiguring Manhattan's philanthropic landscape into something more reflective of the city's diverse reality. The Harlows were formidable opponents with decades of entrenched power, but Usha Vance had something potentially more powerful: the momentum of historical change and the moral clarity of a more inclusive vision. The coming weeks would determine whether established privilege could withstand this fundamental challenge to its authority. The Harlow Foundation occupied the entire 15th floor of a sleek midtown tower, its glass-walled conference room offering commanding views of the Manhattan skyline. This morning, however, the panoramic vista went unappreciated as Vivian presided over an emergency strategy meeting with the Foundation's executive team. Hand-selected for their loyalty and effectiveness, these 6 individuals represented the operational arm of the Harlows' philanthropic influence, the machinery through which their social vision was implemented and enforced. The UN Educational Initiative requires immediate attention, Vivian announced without preamble, her tone making it clear that the normal pleasantries would be dispensed with today. Mrs. Vance's proposal has gained unfortunate traction with certain elements at the United Nations. We need to ensure proper oversight of this project. Charlotte Winthrop, the Foundation's silver-haired executive director and Vivian's closest ally, nodded crisply. I've already spoken with Ambassador Reynolds. As the Foundation's largest donor to UN educational programs, we're insisting on co-chairing the steering committee for any new initiatives. He's agreed this is only appropriate given our historical commitment. Excellent, Vivian replied, making a note on her leather portfolio. And the museum situation? Jackson Pierce, Director of Cultural Partnerships, cleared his throat nervously. The museum board appears enthusiastic about Mrs. Vance's potential involvement, particularly the younger members and recent appointees. Vivian's expression remained neutral, though her perfectly manicured nails pressed more firmly into her leather portfolio. Enthusiasm is often short-lived when confronted with practical realities. Remind our friends on the board about the Harlow Wing renovation, scheduled for next year. Perhaps express our concern that expanding the committee might delay decision-making regarding that $50 million commitment. The implicit threat hung in the air momentarily before Jackson nodded his understanding. The museum's planned expansion depended heavily on Harlow funding, a leverage point Vivian had no qualms about exploiting. What about media management? She continued, turning to her communications director. I'm concerned about the narrative emerging from the Gala. Emma Whitfield, a former political strategist known for her skill in messaging control, pushed her tablet forward. We've activated our media relationships to shape coverage appropriately. The Times piece will acknowledge Mrs. Vance's contribution, but emphasize the Harlow Foundation's decades of leadership. Social coverage is being guided toward a passing the torch to the next generation narrative rather than any suggestion of competition or displacement. Vivian's smile held no warmth. Excellent framing. We welcome fresh voices while maintaining our position as the established authority. The mentorship angle is particularly useful. It positions us as the gracious seniors rather than the challenged incumbents. The meeting continued for another hour, with each department head reporting on specific actions being taken to contain and redirect the threat Usha Vance represented. Throughout, Vivian maintained her composed facade, though those who knew her best could detect the cold anger driving her methodical response. This wasn't merely a defense of social position, but a reassertion of fundamental principles about who belonged and who didn't in the innermost circles of Manhattan power. As the meeting concluded and her team dispersed to implement their assigned tasks, Vivian remained seated, staring contemplatively at the city spread before her. For 3 decades, she had navigated the complex currents of New York society with unmatched skill, transforming her husband's enormous wealth into something more valuable, cultural and social capital that money alone couldn't buy. The Harlow name didn't merely represent billions of dollars, but taste, judgment, and authority. The intangible power to determine what and who mattered. Usha Vance threatened this carefully constructed edifice, not through direct competition, but through something more insidious, the introduction of alternative values that questioned the very foundations of the existing system. Her vision of more inclusive philanthropy implicitly challenged the gatekeeper model that had placed families like the Harlows at the center of civic life for generations. Vivian's private phone chimed with a message from Richard. Meeting set with Senator Grayson tonight, 8 p.m. at the club. She allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. Richard had activated his political connections, another front in their comprehensive campaign to neutralize Usha's growing influence. Senator Grayson sat on the Foreign Relations Committee with oversight of UN funding, a perfectly positioned ally for creating bureaucratic obstacles to Usha's educational initiative. Across town, unaware of the machinery being mobilized against her, Usha was concluding a productive meeting with the Education Access nonprofit. The discussion had yielded concrete plans for integrating their existing programs with her proposed UN initiative, creating a seamless pathway for students from underserved communities to access international opportunities previously reserved for the privileged few. Your timing is impeccable, Mrs. Vance, noted the organization's executive director as they wrapped up. We've been trying to establish UN connections for years without success. The institutional barriers have been significant. Usha nodded, understanding the unspoken reference to the Harlow Foundation's historical role as gatekeeper to such opportunities. Sometimes systems appear impenetrable until challenged from multiple directions simultaneously. I believe we're witnessing a broader opening of previously closed institutions. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, her phone rang with a call from James. How's your day of meetings going? He asked after she answered. Productive but intense, Usha replied, navigating through the midtown crowd. I've confirmed 4 partnership commitments for the UN initiative. The momentum is building faster than I anticipated. That's excellent, James said, though she detected a note of caution in his voice. Though you should know that Richard Harlow was seen entering Senator Grayson's office an hour ago. My sources on the Hill suggest they're meeting to discuss foreign affairs funding priorities. Usha processed this information with the analytical precision that had made her a formidable legal mind. The counterattack begins, predictable but still disappointing. They're attempting to create political obstacles rather than engaging with the substance of the initiative. The Harlows have always preferred working through proxies, James observed. It maintains their public image while limiting direct accountability for their interference. Usha's response was cut short by an incoming call from an unfamiliar number. I need to take this, she told James. I'll see you at home tonight. The new caller identified himself as a reporter from the Wall Street Journal, requesting comment on a developing story about concerns raised regarding proper oversight of the newly announced UN educational initiative. The carefully worded questions revealed the fingerprints of a strategic media plant, subtle implications about Usha's qualifications and experience in managing international programs, thinly veiled suggestions about potential conflicts of interest. Usha navigated the attempted ambush with the same skill she had once used in fielding hostile questions from Supreme Court justices. Her responses were precise, substantive, and forward-looking, repeatedly redirecting attention to the students who would benefit rather than the administrative details the reporter seemed fixated upon. By the time she ended the call, her suspicions were confirmed. The Harlows had activated a multi-pronged counteroffensive combining institutional leverage, political connections, and media manipulation. Their approach was sophisticated and comprehensive, designed to contain her influence while maintaining their public image as benevolent civic leaders. Rather than discouraging her, this realization strengthened Usha's resolve. The scale and speed of their response revealed their recognition of the legitimate challenge she represented. They wouldn't deploy such extensive resources against someone they considered inconsequential. Walking through Bryant Park, Usha noticed a familiar face at one of the small tables. Catherine Blackwell from The Times, apparently engaged in conversation with Charlotte Winthrop from the Harlow Foundation. The two women were leaning toward each other, speaking intently in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt at privacy. Usha altered her path slightly to remain unnoticed, her legal training having taught her the value of observing opponents when they believed themselves unwatched. The apparent coordination between the Foundation and the Times columnist represented another dimension of the Harlow's damage control efforts. Catherine had presented herself as a potential ally during their coffee meeting, but her current tete-a-tete suggested her actual role might be more complex. Rather than feeling discouraged by these mounting challenges, Usha experienced the calm clarity that had always characterized her response to opposition. The Harlows' counterattack revealed their vulnerabilities as clearly as their strengths, their reliance on established networks, their preference for indirect pressure rather than open debate, their fundamental discomfort with transparent challenges to their authority. As she reached the subway entrance, Usha made a strategic decision. Rather than responding directly to the Harlows' maneuvers, she would accelerate her own initiatives, creating such momentum and public visibility around the educational program that attempts to obstruct it would become increasingly difficult to justify. The most effective response to their behind-the-scenes manipulation would be radical transparency and inclusive engagement that invited broad participation in what had previously been exclusive territory. She typed a message to her assistant. Schedule press conference for Thursday morning. Invite education reporters, UN press corps, student representatives from partner schools. Time to bring this conversation into the open. The battle for Manhattan's philanthropic soul was entering a new phase, one that would test not merely competing personalities, but contrasting visions of power, privilege, and purpose in American society. The Harlows had decades of entrenched influence and limitless resources, but Usha had something potentially more powerful, a vision that resonated with emerging values and the strategic patience to pursue systemic change rather than personal victory. The coming days would determine whether established privilege could withstand this fundamental challenge to its authority, and whether Manhattan's tightly controlled philanthropic landscape was indeed ready for transformation. 3 days after the gala, Manhattan's social and philanthropic elite gathered in the United Nations Delegates' Dining Room overlooking the East River. The press conference Usha had hastily organized had transformed into something much larger, a formal announcement of the Educational Pathways Initiative with UN Undersecretary General Elena Morales and representatives from 15 member nations in attendance. The sleek space hummed with anticipation as journalists, educators, diplomats, and social figures awaited the program's unveiling. Vivian and Richard Harlow arrived precisely 10 minutes before the scheduled start, their timing calculated to demonstrate neither excessive eagerness nor dismissive lateness. Vivian wore a perfectly tailored ivory suit that conveyed authority without ostentation, her expression a masterful blend of polite interest and reserved judgment. Richard remained half a step behind her, his physical presence projecting the quiet power of someone accustomed to controlling rooms without needing to dominate them. The Vances are certainly capitalizing on their moment, Vivian remarked quietly to Charlotte Winthrop, who had positioned herself near the entrance to monitor arrivals. Though assembling a press conference so quickly suggests a concerning lack of deliberation, philanthropy requires careful planning, not impulsive announcements. Charlotte nodded obediently, though her eyes betrayed uncertainty as she scanned the impressive gathering. The turnout is significant. The Undersecretary General rarely appears at program announcements of this scale. Elena has always been politically opportunistic, Vivian replied dismissively. She recognizes a media moment when she sees one. The real question is whether there's substantive planning behind the spectacle. Before Charlotte could respond, a ripple of energy moved through the room as Usha and James Vance entered, accompanied by a diverse group that included the museum director, several education nonprofit leaders, and, most surprisingly, 3 teenagers wearing the uniforms of public schools from different boroughs. Usha wore a tailored sapphire blue dress, with subtle gold embroidery at the neckline. Elegant, yet accessible, projecting authority without ostentation. Unlike many women in Manhattan's upper echelons, she had chosen not to hide her cultural heritage, but to incorporate it thoughtfully into her professional presentation. The result was a visual statement about integration rather than assimilation, bringing diverse elements together rather than erasing difference in pursuit of acceptance. The assembled press corps immediately gravitated toward this unexpected grouping, cameras capturing the striking tableau of institutional power and youthful potential, standing together as equals rather than benefactors and recipients. The visual narrative was undeniable, a new model of philanthropy that brought those being served into the conversation about how best to serve them. Vivian watched this media migration with narrowed eyes, recognizing the strategic brilliance of including the students. Their presence transformed what might have been portrayed as a vanity project into a human-centered initiative with visible beneficiaries. The Harlow Foundation had always maintained careful distance between their charitable giving and the actual recipients, a separation that suddenly appeared elitist rather than appropriate. The program began with formal welcomes from UN officials before Undersecretary Morales took the podium. "Today marks an important evolution in our approach to educational access," she announced, her diplomat's polish carrying her words clearly through the space. The Educational Pathways Initiative represents a new model of partnership that connects traditionally separate spheres: international diplomacy, philanthropic resources, educational institutions, and most importantly, the students themselves. Her introduction of Usha was notably warm, emphasizing her legal background and commitment to educational opportunity rather than her social position or wealth. As Usha took her place at the podium, the contrast with traditional philanthropic announcements became even more pronounced. Rather than speaking about the initiative alone, she invited the 3 students to join her, creating a powerful visual statement about shared authority and voice. The purpose of philanthropy shouldn't be to perpetuate existing power structures, but to transform them, Usha began, her voice clear and confident. For too long, decisions about educational access have been made by those furthest from the challenges facing students in underserved communities. This initiative changes that fundamental dynamic. She proceeded to outline a comprehensive program that would bring hundreds of public school students into direct engagement with UN diplomats, create internship pathways into international relations careers, and establish ongoing mentorship relationships between diplomatic professionals and young people traditionally excluded from such networks. The substance behind the vision was evident in the detailed implementation plan, partnership commitments, and transparent accountability structures. Throughout her presentation, Usha never directly referenced the Harlows or their foundation, focusing entirely on the positive vision rather than implied criticism of existing approaches. Yet the contrast was unmistakable to everyone in the room, particularly when she emphasized that the program would be governed collaboratively with student representatives holding equal voting rights to institutional partners. The Harlows' model of philanthropic governance had always been tightly controlled, with power concentrated in the hands of wealthy donors and their designated representatives. Usha's approach implicitly challenged this fundamental assumption about who deserved a voice in decisions affecting underserved communities. Following Usha's presentation, each student spoke briefly about their hopes for the program and their personal journeys to this moment. Their authentic voices and clear articulation of the barriers they had faced resonated powerfully with the assembled press, creating emotional connection that transcended the usual philanthropic announcements focused on dollar figures and institutional partnerships. As the formal presentation concluded and attendees moved into the networking reception, Vivian found herself in the uncomfortable position of being approached rather than approaching others, a subtle but significant reversal of the usual social dynamic. Several longtime allies in the diplomatic community seemed eager to demonstrate their connections to the new initiative, diplomatically suggesting the Harlow Foundation might want to align with this forward-thinking approach. The implied defections stung more than Vivian would ever publicly acknowledge. For decades, she had maintained unquestioned authority in determining philanthropic priorities within her extensive network. Now these same individuals were responding enthusiastically to an alternative vision without seeking her approval or validation. With practiced social skill, she navigated these conversations gracefully while searching for an opportunity to reassert control over the narrative. That moment arrived unexpectedly when she overheard a senior UN official praising Usha's fresh approach to a cluster of influential foundation directors. Fresh approaches certainly have their charm, Vivian interjected smoothly, joining the conversation with practiced ease. Though there's something to be said for established expertise in navigating complex international bureaucracies. The Harlow Foundation's 3 decades of UN partnership have taught us that sustainable impact requires more than idealistic vision. The implied criticism that Usha's approach was naive and unsustainable hung in the air momentarily. The assembled directors shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the opening salvo in what promised to be an uncomfortable confrontation between competing philanthropic philosophies. Before anyone could respond, Usha appeared at the edge of the group, having apparently overheard Vivian's comment. Rather than retreating or responding defensively, she stepped forward with a warm smile that contained not a hint of the hostility Vivian's remark had been designed to provoke. "You've made an excellent point, Vivian," Usha acknowledged, with genuine respect in her voice. "Established expertise is invaluable, which is precisely why this initiative integrates experienced diplomats as mentors alongside the fresh perspectives of students and educators. The most powerful solutions emerge when we combine institutional knowledge with lived experience, traditional approaches with innovative thinking." She extended her hand in a gesture of collegial respect. "I hope the Harlow Foundation will contribute its considerable expertise to this collaborative effort. There's room for all of us in creating better opportunities for the next generation." The gathered witnesses held their collective breath, recognizing the moment for what it was. Not merely a social exchange, but a fundamental choice between competition and collaboration, between defending exclusive territory and embracing shared purpose. For a suspended moment, Vivian hesitated, calculation visible behind her carefully maintained smile. Then, recognizing the strategic impossibility of her position, she accepted Usha's extended hand. To refuse would brand her publicly as petty and territorial, rather than committed to the philanthropic good she claimed to serve. "The Harlow Foundation is always eager to support worthy educational initiatives," she replied smoothly, though those closest could detect the controlled tension in her voice. "We look forward to learning more about your approach." This exchange, witnessed by key figures from Manhattan's philanthropic, diplomatic, and media circles, represented the culmination of the drama that had begun at the Metropolitan Gala. Usha's legendary clapback wasn't a cutting remark or public humiliation, but something far more devastating to Vivian's established order, a generous invitation to partnership that simultaneously acknowledged the Harlow's historical contributions while firmly establishing a new model that rendered their exclusive gatekeeping obsolete. As Vivian retreated to Richard's side at the edge of the room, she maintained her perfect composure, though those who knew her best could recognize the magnitude of what had just occurred. She hadn't merely lost a social skirmish, but witnessed the emergence of a new paradigm that fundamentally challenged the system that had secured her position for decades. The billionaire's wife had indeed been outmaneuvered, not through confrontation, but through transformation, not by attacking the existing order, but by offering a compelling alternative that made its limitations self-evident. Usha Vance's legendary clapback would reverberate through Manhattan's social and philanthropic circles for years to come, not as a moment of personal triumph, but as the beginning of systemic change long overdue.